Just before we start the discussion, I thought I would actually offer some observations about HDR and film. We have distributors and manufacturers pushing for 4K pipelines. We have DPs pushing for the worst piece of glass you could ever imagine to put in front of the sensors. We have manufacturers and distributors pushing for ultra-wide gamut color spaces, which in languages is beyond P3. The main one at the moment is Rec 2020. But we have a trend that's starting to happen, I've noticed in the last 6 months, which is the idea of vintage workflows. What is commonly happening now is that we have a color workflow that, from a studio viewpoint, particularly Disney, Fox, and Warner Brothers, ideally, where we are encouraged to be ACES compliant. We are overlaying on top of this ACES compliant workflow color manipulations, grades, and operations that are really going back to emulate what we used to do by sticking a piece of gelatin in a vat of chemicals. I've spent quite a lot of time over the last year trying to work out just what is it that we're kind of doing from a big picture viewpoint. I guess these comments, without prejudice, are not the statements of Technicolor nor Filmlight or anybody else, but these are just really my observations. And that's, we have manufacturers of display technologies, projectors, monitors, who are pursuing the ability to display what I call fluorescent colors, which are high luminance colors with high saturation content. My observation is they're actually not very pleasant colors to look at, and that the filmmakers are actually pursuing colors that are beautiful, luxurious, aggressive. Those colors, from a technical viewpoint, tend to be not desaturated, but in fact lower luminance values with in fact greater saturation. If we model that into a color space type, or a very analytical way of describing that, you could say that we are pursuing, at least the filmmakers are pursuing imagery that has desaturated highlights and quite richly saturated lowlights. In terms of color spaces, the manufacturers and the display mediums are pursuing color spaces that ideally would display everything known to mankind. The definition of the ACES color space will in fact display, theoretically, colors beyond what we can even see. The interesting thing is, if we model that and try to put into a color space the idea of these deeply saturated colors, it's called a film print. And what's also interesting is, if you overlay all these different color spaces, we've actually come full circle. So in some ways, HDR is fantastic because now we have display mediums that are predictable, they're controlled, and no longer do we need to worry about, is the bulb working today, and is there enough smoke and nicotine on the projector booth light that has smothered it out? And, you know, is the film print on aim today? So in terms of our distribution medium, we're in a very good place at the moment. Certainly we're offered many alternates, but the overall concept, regardless of whether it's Dolby, Barco, Eclair Color, Sony, or IMAX for theatrical, regardless of whether it's HDR10, LMG, or Dolby Vision, or Dolby Pulsar, the intention of all the manufacturers is in fact honorable, and that is to reproduce accurately an image. What's not happening is the etiquette, which is why I just thought it would be good to go back and look at this historically for a second. In those halcyon days of film print, a production company, which can be the director, DP, and production designer, so basically the team, would make the display medium for their film. And that was called a film print, and it was a physical thing. This physical item had all the creative intent of the production company. So the only thing that the distribution company could do to it would be scratch it to pieces or give it to a cinema who's running it on a really bad projector. But The etiquette or the protocol was that the production company would make this finished product with a finished image that represented everyone's intent. We've gone from a centralized voice managing the creative intent through to now what are 4 voices. The production company, and obviously within that you have a lot of voices. The director, production designer, DP, the gaffer, depending how cheeky he is. You then have a studio who will have their opinion about what a North American romantic comedy should look like. They will have their opinion on whether a dark noir film, what that should look like. Should an animation film for children have more saturation and color than an animation film for adults? So you have that dialogue. The studio now has another voice, which is marketing, who is then offering feedback as to whether something is working or not. And now we have a new voice, and that's the manufacturers saying, for example, the Barco laser technology is more attractive than perhaps the Sony laser technology. An observation we need to be aware of is that lasers will not be the savior to the aesthetic language of film, because at the moment, other than, say, the Dolby, you try to get a range of blue and cyans on your laser projector. You can't. All blues look the same. In the old days, the production company could manage the actual distribution medium. Now, that is not the case. What is still evolving is that there are quite radical differences in how those 4 voices are managed. There is an etiquette and a protocol as to how the creative intent is managed. And it's also dependent on the agents defining in their contracts as to who gets to do the grade. So, for example, a film that I finished last year, Snowman with Dion Beebe for Universal, Martin Scorsese, exec producer. It was part of the contract that the DP would supervise the final grade and the HDR grade. For example, Darkest Hour with Bruno and Joe Wright, once we started shooting, it became clear there's going to be something a little special about this film. Because it was considered by Focus Pictures with a pickup deal with Universal to be a kind of art house film, it was never really considered for what we call the large format releases. The Dolby laser projectors, all these kind of mediums are kind of demographic specific for the kiddies film, you know, the Marvels and the event films. I thought that this film would be the perfect film for a medium such as a Dolby laser system. There was one explosion, and there's no alien battles, which meant that the audience, you would think, would be maybe a little more mature, but I made the case that that is the very audience that would appreciate and demand extremely high quality in all areas of the film, both in acting and the craft, but also the visual and the sound. So we made that presentation to the studio, who then agreed. So we did a Dolby laser with a Dolby Atmos, and it's proven to be correct. And we also organized that the marketing presentations would happen on a Dolby laser projector. That's what I mean about trying to have that kind of dialogue, because there's just a lot of voices now. So that's, again, just another observation.